Welcome everybody with the seminar. You know that this is the last seminar in a series that we had this year, and where we wanted to present you with opportunities and activities that are actually going on in our university. So last time we had Dr. Boodoo with the Center for African Studies, we had the Center for Catholic Social Thought, so we had students from the law school. And it's a pleasure that we now have a very special guest who is Professor of Business Ethics in the School for Business in Duquesne. So Professor Dr. Jim Weber. And he is well known because he, of course, sometimes you say there is not that much distinction anymore, at least in certain areas, between healthcare ethics and business ethics. So we certainly can learn a lot from what he's doing here in Duquesne, and maybe also he gives you some ideas for when you are thinking about your dissertation, your proposal, that maybe there are also opportunities you can use here in your own university. So it's a pleasure to ask him to take the floor.
Thank you very much. I really am excited to be here. I get really tired of business students a lot, but it's exciting to see what you're doing and hearing about it. So I last year shoved my way through the crack in the door and said, please let me come and talk to some of your students. And in a apparent moment of weakness, they said, okay, and here I am. But I'm following the African Center and the lawyers, that's not a problem, but the Catholics and stuff. But it's fun to be here, and I think it's good. When I came here, and give you a little bit of background, I came here actually in 1993. Some of you might have been alive in 1993, so you, not so much. But I came here and I formed what was called the Duquesne University Ethics Roundtable. The acronym is DUER. I spent 2 months on the acronym. But what it was is, I was in the business school, I was the only person doing anything close to ethics in the business school, and I was really, really lonely. And I simply tried to identify anyone else on campus that was doing ethics. As it turns out, there's a lot of people on this campus doing ethics. There was your predecessor in healthcare ethics. There was a center in communication ethics. There were philosophers and theologians. Every professional school had an ethicist. I ended up with like 20, 25 people that were able to come together periodically for lunches and have a conversation about ethics. So it's an exciting place for me to be. It is absolutely the place I want to be. And as you'll see in a couple of instances, Duquesne really has established itself in the business school, as well as I think in the university, including your program, as a really key place to be in terms of the ethics focus. So I came here in 1993, and right at that time the university was going through some changes, and John Murray was president, which in my mind saved the university. He's a marvelous individual and a strong believer in ethics. Because of that, the business school also focused more on ethics, and they asked me to develop an undergraduate course in business ethics that's required of all the business students since then. They also had me take their graduate ethics course, and eventually became a requirement for our MBA students. And then probably the biggest change was in 2000, the Dean of the School of Leadership and Professional Advancement came to the Dean of the Business School and said, we want to start a program in a Master's of Leadership and Business Ethics. Can you deliver 6 courses in ethics? And the Dean turned to me and I said, sure. No idea. And can you offer it online? Sure. No idea. And that's how the Master's was born. I learned a lot. And I also learned we offer 5 classes, not 6. And as Kathy can attest to, I ran out of classes after about 2. The students suggested some ideas, we kicked around some ideas, and the one course I've held on to, which is my favorite course, is the Global Ethics course, which is completely misnamed, by the way, but it's the best name we could have. It's really how the 6 world religions are applied to business. And I got to tell you, this is the most exciting thing, but I just had a student email me from this semester. She just started a new job and has a number of people who are not Christian. And she said, your class has helped me understand some of their background, differences that we have, some similarities. So I really like the fact that something I'm doing in the classroom has direct application to what's going on in the real world, which is really my focus on ethics. I'm not a theoretician very much. I'm very much an applied ethicist and kind of like that kind of focus. So I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce some things to you and talk a little bit about what's going on down in Rockwell Hall, which you may not get down there very often because I don't get up here very often either. But there's some fun things happening. In terms of curriculums I mentioned, we have the Masters of Science in Leadership and Business Ethics, which is now 5 courses as part of the 12-course Masters program. We offer it both online and face-to-face on Saturdays. that's been an exciting opportunity for me to deal with what we call adult learners, which is a nice acronym for people that are like 30 years and older in many cases. But it's a whole different population, and some of you have experienced that, I'm sure, and both as a student and as an instructor, that they have different things going on in their lives. And I have students who have trouble accessing the class online because they're running bombing missions in Afghanistan, and they're in other places where if they told me where they were, they'd have to kill me, kind of a thing. It's really different. And just a real quick story, I talk about trust a lot in that class, and the example I like to use is that when I go to a restaurant, I trust that the waitress is not going to spit in my food. That's a very basic element of trust. I post that to my class. One of my students came back and says, well, yeah, and I trust the fact when I'm flying the F-16 over some country that the other person next to me in the other plane is going to clip my wings and we're all going to die. I think, well, that's a pretty good example too. You know, I just don't really understand that too much, but the people that bring information to the class is so exciting. And as you probably know, ethics to me is really easy and fun to teach anyway. But the master's is really fun. We also have an MBA with a sustainability focus, which I think ties in a lot to the ethics area as well. It's an exciting group of people, and really interesting possibilities, international in our student body, and just a real nice population of students that we have in the program besides the MBA. We have a business ethics and global citizenship course required of all undergraduate students, as I mentioned, and an applied business ethics course required of all MBA students. Now, what this has generally done is, I think, it created a nice little curriculum structure, but it's always nice when somebody outside the business school says that as well. So there was a survey done mostly on how do business ethics courses get driven. And these people were really fun. They took the top 30 business schools as ranked by Business Week and other deans and people, and none of them do ethics much at all. So the prestigious schools don't really pay attention to this. They finally got to the religious schools, and that's where it went off the chart. And then they got to Georgetown, Notre Dame, and Duquesne, which is what most people refer to us as. And we were actually taken out of the study because we were such outliers. On a 10-point scale, the average scale was the students had usually between 2 or 3 classes in ethics. We had 10. And we were just so far advanced than the other schools, except for Notre Dame and Georgetown. So we kind of use that as one of the top 3 business schools in terms of curriculum, and it's exciting to have that opportunity. What complements this, and it's always the cart before the horse in terms of classes and faculty, is who do we have here? And I'm excited that we have a number of people. Dr. Wasilewski, the exciting part is he was my student in the ethics course, who then went to Pitt, so I was on his dissertation committee. Then we had to hire somebody, and I was very fair and not biased. My faculty decided we should hire him. I said, yay. He's now my boss. He's now chair of the department, which is really kind of entertaining. But it's kind of a nice tradition to see that David's doing a lot of really interesting kind of work. And I'll mention one of the papers that we've done together. Virginia Gertie is another woman I knew as a doctoral student at Virginia Tech, who's now here. And the legacy is from Pitt. If you know, there's a school in Oakland called the University of Pittsburgh. It's not very good. But in the business ethics area, it's, in my mind, the best school, which is why I came from California to here. David also went through the program, and Virginia studied under a guy who went through the program at Pitt. So we have a Pitt Mafia kind of mentality. But it's a really strong program. It's generated a lot of different scholars in the field. And we have 3 people here in business ethics. There are very other few schools, business schools in the country, that have 3 ethics faculty, especially an ethics faculty without a PhD program. So it's an exciting time to have people here. We've also, besides me, added Dr. Robert Srofe, who runs the sustainability program, so we've been doing a lot of collaboration. And then it's amazing how many other professors. I worked with a woman in supply chain management. I've worked with an accounting professor. I worked with another accounting professor, who happens to be my wife. I've done all sorts of co-authored opportunities with other faculty in the business school. It's a really nice, interesting dynamic. So lots of different people there, lots of things going on in terms of what we're doing. Well, I want to mention, if you want to get more food, feel free. And if you want to ask questions or stop me, feel free. We'll have some time again too. But I'll just keep on going for like 4 days. So at some point in time, you want to stop me. Okay. What do I really want to do? Well, I don't know. I talk about some general questions that might be relevant to you in terms of research ideas or things you've been thinking about. But I want to talk about this whole notion of behavioral business ethics. That's really my area. It's all about how people act or don't act and how these things work. And I generally take more of a micro kind of focus, looking at the individual. But I have progressed in my research now to also look at an organizational or macro level focus and trying to figure out things like, how does corporate social responsibility, or the more modern term, corporate citizenship, or the emergence of sustainability and triple bottom line, all fit into this. So these are all kind of hot topics and there may be other areas of research. The thing that I find really comfortable stepping into a healthcare environment is, everything I do is relevant to what you're doing. I don't see any difference. In fact, I don't want to say that healthcare is a subset of business ethics because you'll get upset about that, but it's a very close marriage, or cousins or siblings or something. There's a lot of overlap between, and it's the difference I see between medical ethics of when does life begin, when does life end, and healthcare ethics, which is the managing of the care of people's lives. And in that sense, as you probably know, every organization that does healthcare is a business. Some are nonprofit, like UPMC, some are for-profit. So the business ethics, healthcare ethics, I think overlaps quite a bit. So some of the things I'll be talking about are probably relevant to things you might be thinking about as well. Okay. Okay. So, I started out, before most of you were born, why do good people do bad things? And this does struggle, and partly you have to remember also, besides my PhD in business, which is nice to have, I have an undergraduate degree in theology. And part of it was understanding about people in relationship to God and other kinds of things. And it was clear to me that if people are made in God's image and God is all good, then people are good. That's the theological argument. So why then do good people do bad things? And it's been a lifelong quest. I still don't have an answer, and I hope I never do, because then I'll be done and I can stop working. But I love this question of why do good people do bad things? And the interesting thing that's starting to happen now is the fact that research is starting to bring in the psychologists even more. It's good people do bad things, but they still think they're doing good things. Think about that for a second. Now if you've got people doing bad things, but they think they're still doing good, whoa, then all sorts of things we think we can use to control bad behavior aren't going to work because it's not bad behavior. We convince ourselves it's good behavior or acceptable behavior. So lots of interesting kind of questions that come into this area for research. What influences our decision making? A lot of people think it's your background. It probably is, because it certainly isn't a complete answer. It's also the context in which you're making a decision. Are you different as a student or an employee or a member of your church or synagogue or a member of your community? Well, start to. I'm different as a grandparent than I am as a spouse. I'm different with graduate students versus undergraduate students. The context can make a difference. So what influences me? And that kind of questions we need to raise as well. Are certain types of people prone to unethical acts? And that's more of a scientific question with the natural sciences to start to ask. Are we wired in certain ways? That certain people are wired toward unethical behavior or ethical behavior? It was real simple when I was a student and doctoral student. To know the literature, there was only a little bit of literature. Now, 30 years later, there's a lot of literature. And now all of a sudden we're looking into all sorts of other areas. The hard sciences are a big issue. Evolutionary psychology, looking at animal behavior. I mean, there's all sorts of questions which people are raising, which wasn't even relevant at the time I was trying to study this. Now we have to ask these kinds of questions. Certain types of work promote unethical acts. Are attorneys really inherently unethical? Well, maybe it's the work they do makes it hard. When I hire lawyers to teach in business ethics, I ask them one very important question. Do you understand the difference between professional ethics and business ethics? As a professional, you defend your client. You might lie to defend your client. From a business ethics standpoint, I think that's wrong. From a professional ethics standpoint, they may argue that's right. Or if your client tells you something other than risking your own life or someone else's, you have a confidentiality. You may not divulge something that might be important. If your client says, I really did sell those drugs, you have to defend the person as if they were not guilty. To me, ethically, I have trouble with that. So there's all sorts of kinds of questions here about types of work that may come into play. The organizational level became something I got more interested in, partly as Kathy knows, in the organizational ethics course we teach in the program. What are businesses doing? And in the healthcare area, you preceded business organizations. Hospitals had ethics committees well before business organizations figured out what was going on. So what are organizations doing to promote unethical or ethical behavior? And yes, it's both. If I set up the fact that I'm going to monitor you to find out whether you're being ethical or not, does that motivate you to do some things behind the scenes or in a way that I can't find out that actually might promote unethical behavior? So we've got all sorts of challenges here in terms of how do organizations create an ethical environment. We have a meeting of the ethics officers on campus every quarter, and we're having a conversation on how to hire the ethical employee. Every company would want to do that. An hour and a half later, we figure out we have no idea how to do that. But what was troubling to me was there were 2 interns working at Highmark. They were undergraduate students at that school in Oakland. And they said, do you know that when you ask us questions, like ethical, challenging questions in a job interview, we're told how to answer those questions. We're scripting for students how to answer a challenging question in an ethical way, as opposed to are they really being ethical or not. Do we really find out about what's going on and what's the organization doing to try to promote ethical behavior? It doesn't always work out. Okay. And then how can they promote ethical behavior? It kind of ties into that. So these are kind of general questions I had. I'm going to breeze through this next one a little bit quicker. But every business area talks about ethics. Accountants, finance people, all sorts of people. But more importantly, all the social sciences talk about ethics. But so do the natural sciences. And there's also culture, religious, regional, socio-political. I don't know where ethics isn't relevant. So I think it kind of ties into almost anything that's going on. And I think those are some of the interesting challenges we have as well. Okay. I think, are these slides available to them?
Yeah, we have in the folder.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, I didn't see you had in there. Okay, good. Okay. Good, go faster. Okay, I needed to give you at least some background because I didn't really know how much you knew. And I'm mostly giving this to you as a graduate student with a reference. And the bibliography is also in your packet, I think. Is that true too? Okay, so you can look all these things up, or you can ask me about them. But in terms of theoretical foundation, and you probably have had ethical theory and decision making or some background in that. So you know deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and here's some sites. The reason I bring this up is these are the business ethics version of philosophy. And there are philosophers in there who converted to business ethics. But we've kind of talked about these issues. It's a pretty well-known established area. What I find more interesting is the whole philosophy management area, and there's lit reviews. And I listed these and looked at them and said, oh my God. So I went to Scott Reynolds of the Weber and Reynolds, who's probably one of the best empirical researchers I know right now at the University of Washington, and said, Scott, I need to update this. And he goes, you know, except for the 2010, which isn't really a good lit review anyway, there hasn't really been much done since they did their work in 2006. So I'm thinking if all of you have a lot of free time, we could do a lit review in the field. It will take hundreds of hours of work and it'll be a lot of fun. But you're probably not going to do that. But there really is an interesting area. But there are some interesting lit reviews. For example, there are like 70 plus studies that have asked, are men more ethical than women? How many people think women are more ethical than men? Raise your hand. Oh, I thought I'd get all the women raise your hand. Are you kidding me? So all you women just lie because you know you are, you just don't want to tell about it. But it's interesting because what Scott's actually done is he said that's actually a bad question. It really is. It's a bad question because it depends, is usually how he answers questions, but there are certain things about how women are hardwired compared to men, which actually allow women to make better ethical decisions than men. I know that's not hard, but that's also what happens with gender. So it depends on the question. So there's lots and lots of studies out there, and some of them hasn't gotten very far in terms of understanding the field. So we need to keep looking at these kinds of things, but building on previous literature. So I thought that was at least a good list that we had. Okay. And then there's some decision models that have also been out there for a while. I mentioned the Reynolds one just because I think he's got a lot more to say lately than some of the more classic ones. But I want to talk about a couple of those just to kind of give you a bit of an introduction. Trevino, and there's a quick story here. Linda's a dear friend at Penn State and was a doctoral student at the same time I was a doctoral student. And in the middle of her doctoral program, she published in the Academy of Management Review, which is the premier theoretical journal in management. #1 theory journal in management as a doctoral student. She immediately got disdain from every other doctoral student in the entire program in every other school in the country. We all hated her. How can a doctoral student publish in a top-tier journal as a solo author? We all hate her. We don't really. We all envy her tremendously, but she's an amazing individual and publisher and done some incredible things. In fact, there's 3 people in the field, Linda and then Scott Reynolds, another guy. If I read their paper as a blind reviewer, I know it's one of those 3. No one else writes as perfectly designed a research study as those 3 people are able to do. And I've been right almost every time I've read their paper. It's just amazing how they can put these things together. So Linda had a great start. But what really irks me about her paper, not that she got published, it's so simple. How hard is it to figure this out? You start off with an ethical dilemma, okay? And then the individual goes through some kind of a cognitive moral development thinking, okay? Then who they are as an individual moderates, the situation they're in moderates, and there's some kind of behavior. Duh. She's got an AMR. I don't. She's got an AMR as a doctoral student. This is just disgusting. But it's a really nice model. And I love the model. Basically, I really jumped into the cognitive moral development stuff. I really like that a lot. But we think about this as your own process, and then other personality factors come into play, other situation moderated. A real simple model, but it's a very robust one that can be used quite a bit in the field. Then Tom Jones in '91 does something also like, duh. He says there's something called moral intensity. No kidding. Situations, based on the context of them, the characteristic situation will make a difference. So for example, I'm sorry, this is Jones talking about Jim Rest. I'm sorry, let me back. Jones is talking about Jim Rest in his paper. So how we're going through this model of the environment kind of influences you. Do you recognize the moral issue? And here's the real problem. When I ask my undergraduate students, is it unethical that you don't show up for class? No. It may not occur to them it's a moral issue at all. I think it's a moral issue. There's personal consequences, there's responsibility to other people on their team they may have to meet with, all sorts of ethical issues. Hey, I think there are moral issues in everything. I changed the shirt I was going to wear 3 times this morning as a moral discernment of what is appropriate to wear to talk to you. Because in my other classes, I'm sitting there listening to students present and giving a test this afternoon. I could have dressed without teaching in front of everybody. I thought it'd be nice to dress a little more business professional here today. Different things we do in our lives make a big difference. And I think this is important. I had to make a moral choice between, do I take the invitation to come here, which conflicts with the class I have in 10 more minutes. Ethical dilemma. I saw it as an ethical dilemma. I talked over with my chair, and my chair is proctoring the exam in 10 minutes. But these are ethical kinds of questions. So are we aware of them, recognize them, make the moral judgments, have the moral intent, and then engage in behavior? Very basic 4-stage model that Jim Rest proposes that Jones talks about in his article. But Jones also comes up with a very simple concept called moral intensity. That's what I want to talk about a little bit. Does it make a difference? So let me ask you a quick question. How many people regularly give blood? Very few do that. How many people would give blood if a family member needed it? Moral intensity. It's real simple. It really is the question of, in this case it would be more the question of proximity. How close are you associated with it? You know, and in deference to people from other countries and things, but, you know, I know there are people dying of hunger in other countries. There are people dying of hunger in Pittsburgh. And it seems to me that we should have the moral compulsion to deal with things close to us. The problem is trying to relate to something that's farther away. I have a student in my class from the Ukraine. Oh my God, I am so much more sensitive to what's going on in the Ukraine now because of her. She's brought me into that kind of connection because her family's still there. So how do we figure about the intensity of the situation affects our decision making? Okay. What is your name?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Chrissy.
Chrissy?
Mm-hmm.
If I said I'm going to hit you in the head, you worried?
Yeah.
Really? I'm way over here. How long do you think my arms are? Now, as I start walking toward you, are you getting more worried?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you should. These kinds of issues come into play. Or if I say, well, in 100 years, the world's going to come to an end. In 2 weeks, the world's coming to an end, we might be more worried about it. Or if I said, I'm not just going to hit you in the head, I'm going to take out a gun and shoot you in the chest, you might be more concerned about the gun than the hit in the head, right? It's all relative. But this is the moral intensity issue. There's been a lot of really good research done in this area to try to understand why do people respond in different ways to ethical situations. And it's when you make it relevant to them in terms of the kind of issue you bring to play. So I thought those are some good models that kind of introduce the field in terms of what business ethicists people generally do. My area is really in the area of moral reasoning. And I jumped in on this early on in the field, and my mentor at Pitt simply said, you have to do something that distinguishes you in the field. And honestly, this did. I'm one of the first people that applied moral reasoning into the business area with managers. My 1990 dissertation data has probably been more cited than anything else. Now other people have done some really good things, but I kind of established myself, and this is a really fun area, and there's some really good literature here if you're interested. So let me just kind of share with you the paper real quick. Do you know Kohlberg's moral development stuff? A little bit? Okay, some of you do. You may recognize the Heinz dilemma, which is the classic Kohlberg dilemma, where the individual is faced with a dilemma that a spouse is dying of cancer. The druggist in town has developed an experimental drug that might save the wife's spouse's life, but the druggist is charging 10 times more than what the person can afford. So does the person steal the drug to save the dying spouse, or respect the druggist's right to property? That ethical dilemma is fascinating to me. I've used that literally thousands of times. And the last time I checked, the answers was 51% yes, 49% no. It was almost a perfect split. It's a great dilemma. People are very divided over what to do. What I did is, in my dissertation, I came up with two other stories, Evelyn and Roger, which are actually based on true stories written by MBA students at Michigan, who, unfortunately, the guy who just mentioned them just passed away. But there were stories about a woman who found a problem with a product and wasn't sure what the problem was, but was still working on it. In the meantime, the boss says, I know what it is, changed her data, and reported as if here's the problem. Does she challenge the boss in falsifying her data? Most people say yes, she would. The Roger dilemma is about an accountant who found an illegally made loan and discovered it. The partner in the office says, don't tell anybody about this, we can't afford to lose a client, just put it under the covers. And if you don't, you'll get fired. And most people know the right thing to do is you disclose the loan to the officials. So these are some dilemmas that I have, and then you start looking at how different people respond. So in this study, I basically asked business managers what their reasoning process was according to the Kohlberg model and the standard scoring. I had 37 managers, which doesn't sound like a large database, except I'm spending 1 to 2 hours in a face-to-face interview with them. That's the problem with dissertation data collection, when you want to sit down with an interview with someone and that much time. But we were able to do it, thankfully, because the people at Pitt were helping me with this. So I conducted personal interviews, the 2 dilemmas that were new, and I kind of gave the new scoring method, which people seem to like. Most managers, 86%, were at the conventional level of reasoning, basically concerned about the immediate group or others. Now, there's a quick funny story here. I also ties it into values, and I predicted that managers would be of a certain value type. And I said 60-some-odd% would be this value type, and those managers would reason at stage 2, which is pre-conventional. And my dissertation chair said, what do the groups think about situations at the pre-conventional stage 2 level? He said, well, there's 2 groups that come to my mind, adolescents and prison convicts. He said, you're predicting that most business managers think like adolescents or prison convicts. I went, yeah. And in all fairness, some of my managers I think now are prison convicts, so they kind of worked out, but he wouldn't let me do it. I ran the data, it didn't prove what I needed to prove, I ran it the way I wanted it, and it came out. We really do think, by the way, think about stage 2. We think about consequences to ourselves. We are fairly selfish in our thinking. Some of us go beyond that to think about others, depends on the situation. But what I found is I think it's an inflated type of reasoning. And when given certain prompts in the interview, managers are able to think about the group, society, work group, organization, those kinds of things. So it was kind of an interesting study, I thought. Managers, small organizations, slightly higher. And then the dilemma started to have a big impact. Which situation was given to them, how certain things started to happen. The Evelyn dilemmas appear to be a minor issue. So they thought about, well, what's in it for me? Should I confront my boss? How's it going to affect my job? And then I throw in the thing, well, by the way, the product is a brake on a school bus. If it malfunctions, children will die. Reasoning goes up. Moral intensity kicks in. So lots of ways to think about and try to understand how people think through the ethical situation. And as you that know Kohlberg, the higher the stages of reasoning, the more likely you're acting in a more ethical way than the lower stages of reasoning.
Quick question about how you think, well, in terms of your work, how you use Kohlberg's scale. Like, I mean, if you look at the scale that was up there, and we have the handout in front of us, I mean, stage 6 sounds like Kant, stage 6 sounds like 5 sounds like Rawls, 4 sounds like Hobbes, right? I mean, Kohlberg's sort of like loading the deck in terms of, right, it's a normative framework that he pitches, sometimes I think as a descriptive framework.
Yeah, sure. I don't see that in his writing as explicitly, but who's to tell how he was influenced in terms of the philosophers. I'm okay kind of with this in the sense of what I understand his models be as concentric circles. The most narrow focus is self. Then you go to the immediate group, larger group, and then beyond society. And that's kind of the language he uses. But you're right, there's some interesting ethical theories that kind of match into this. The biggest challenge was Gilligan, if you know, in the 80s, which is one of his students, challenged that his model is male-centric. Well, the problem is that all of his subjects were males. Who is his dissertation chair? Because they ought to be slapped in the head for letting someone only use little boys growing up to men in a dissertation. That's dumb to begin with. But I will tell you, my 37 managers, I met Carol Gilligan. I met the perfect woman-thinking manager I've ever met, and I had no trouble coding her at stage 5 and 6, the way she gave her answers. So you've got to be careful. There are some biases, but there's so much research that's been done that it seems to mitigate that. The only problem we have now with global ethics is communitarian cultures, which is mostly China, Japan, Korea, tend to be topping out at stage 4. They don't really get to the justice issue, which is embedded in his top stages, or utilitarian focus beyond the community. So I don't know, we can talk about this forever, but
Sure.
You're right, there are some issues that are there. I haven't seen it, first of all, the problem I have is I haven't got any managers at the higher stages anyway. So some of the biases at the higher stages, as an empiricist, doesn't come into play. I'm just trying to get the managers out of stage 2 into stage 3. But you're right, there are the formalist and consequentialist kind of decision making that's going on too.
I guess my question too, like to step back, is so you're gathering descriptive data,
Yeah.
and then are you making a
Well,
normative argument with it? Or
Yeah, I
are
don't think
you-
I'm gathering descriptive data, because I don't think there is descriptive data, but that's why I get hammered on my reviews for my papers, because I get all these social scientist people that don't like me. I think everything's normative. I don't even have a problem if you think you're doing the ethical thing and only think about yourself. I think that's a normative statement. But yes, that's the problem. People say I'm collecting descriptive data, but I think this is a normative model. It's hierarchical in terms of progression. If people mature, we assume people mature in a positive way, mature across time, from stages up to, from 1 maybe to 4 or 5, if they're lucky. There is empirical support that the higher stages correspond to ethical decisions as opposed to unethical decisions. So there's some argumentation for taking a descriptive data and applying a normative dimension to it. But you're right, that's a problem. I got hammered in my last paper on arguing that corporate training programs in ethics, there are some positives and negatives. And I got hammered because I used the word positive and negative. Well, too bad, because they are. So the normative stuff, I mind, comes into play maybe more in some places than it should, but I think this is normative.
I was just sort of curious about
Yeah.
how you were thinking about it. Thank you.
Oh yeah, everything's normative. Okay, your question's normative. Okay. Okay, I get to ask this stuff. And then the exciting thing is, I got tenure. So I got to challenge all of my work and say, Weber's wrong, which is really a neat thing to do in your life. If you get to that point in your research, you can say, all the stuff I did before is wrong, because I think it was at least questionable. So I found a colleague, Janet Gillespie, and we did a study toward the end of the 1990s, where we looked at the theory of planned behavior and Kohlberg's theory. Basically, it breaks down to, you have beliefs, you have intentions, and you have behavior. And we affectionately call this the should, would, did paper. What should you do? What would you do? What did you do? So we try to play into this kind of model. And we got a group of, again, I think they're managers, some people think they're MBA students, but they're full-time managers. And we basically asked them a common situation. Have you observed some kind of a cheating or stealing situation? Cheating the company in terms of stealing whatever. Something that was so basic and common that everybody said yes. And we said, okay, and through a series of questions we asked them, if you have, should you act if you observe this? Would you act if you observe this? Did you act if you observe this? And we got open-ended responses, coded according to Kohlberg, as I do everything in my life. And it was interesting because we found 84% of the people said they should act if they see this common problem. 64% would, and 40% did. And here's the start of questioning Weber and everybody else's work. All previous ethics work generally is asking the normative hypothetical question. Should you challenge your boss? Should you report this? Should you act in a certain way? And we all think better of ourselves than we really are. Okay? A little harsh, oh, not a couple of you. We all do. So this is the challenge we have. So all of a sudden, if you're asking what should you do? Should you steal the drug to save your dying spouse? We're going to get a much more inflated answer than what really happens. And that was my question, is what's really happening in terms of research and behavior. And then I bring in the model of Kohlberg. And keep in mind that all these nice little stage 5, 6 issues go out the window, because at best we're getting somewhere between maybe stage 3 and 4, most likely between stage 2 and 3. Because now we're asking reality questions, not inflated hypothetical questions. So should I act? Stage level here is higher. Would I act? Stage drops down. Did I act? We get into reality between stages 2 and 3. Adolescents and early adults. But a more narrow focus on self or focus on the immediate group. So my research, I'm trying to get at is, why do people do what they do? And I think it's how they frame the question, how they understand it, some of the contexts that come into play. Okay? So, conclusions were, you need to be cautious about these hypothetical situations. And yours, if anything, in healthcare, you've got some very dramatic issues you're asking. And I would bet that if you asked me 20 years ago, what I think about euthanasia, quality of life, major kind of healthcare questions. Now that I'm not that young, my opinions have changed to some extent. They've changed because I've seen my parents go through end stages of life and death. I have more people, I'm going to funerals, I'm going to weddings. There's lots of kinds of things that happen, very emotionally charged kinds of questions. So to ask a theoretical question, I think, is less telling than asking a real situation and a real kind of a question that we have. So that was kind of, I thought was an important idea. And then the moderate relationship between belief, intention, and actual behavior anyway. So, okay. I'm going to real quick shift to then the macro level, which is now in the organizational focus. And this comes out of really teaching the MBA ethics course. I would teach this in about the 5th week of the semester. A student would come to me and say, Dr. Weber, I know what the right answer is. Never going to happen at my work. Well, that is wrong. I want it to affect your work. I want it to be relevant. And we start talking. He says, the organization will never let me do this. They'll let me question these things, all sorts of issues. And I realized that virtually everyone, including faculty at universities, students at universities, are all in some kind of organizational context. And that starts to have an impact on our decision-making and behavior. So a lot of my work has now shifted toward ethical work climate that came out in 1988, Victor and Cullen, two very interesting people. 5 years later, the young, I guess not tenured yet because I was here, untenured faculty member goes to an Academy of Management meeting, the premier meeting, and runs a session on challenging Victor and Cullen's work. And I got 3 other colleagues at other universities, and the 4 of us present fairly critical evaluations of Victor and Cullen. And then the 2 discussants for our session were Victor and Cullen. It was phenomenal. It was so much fun. Well, I put together a session in June now for another conference to challenge their work again. And one of the 2 people I asked to join me said, do you remember 10 years ago we did it? So in 1993, 2004, and 2014, I put together seminars to challenge Victor and Cullen's work. I love this work. It's so much fun to challenge it, to question it, but it's such a rich research area. So I think it's a good one to think about when you talk about work climate in organizations. So it came up with an initial 3x3 that collapses into 5 types. And I do want to mention, I had a student working at Mercy, no, but you can see Mercy, in my MBA class. And I always ask my MBA students to do an ethical work climate analysis of their organization. And I thought it was interesting that she came to me and says, I'm going to have to split my data. And I said, why don't you? It's because I'm pretty sure if I try collapsing the data from the doctors, the nurses, and the technicians, it's going to be a mess. So I said, you're right, keep your data split. And you're shaking after you've worked in hospitals. Oh my God. You think the doctors are a little different than the nurses and the technicians? Totally different in their thought process, what they think is their job, all sorts of kinds of things. So you really have to be aware of the fact that there can be subpopulations. And that's the work I want to talk about very briefly. Is I decided to look at a bank. And I decided there were sub-climates in this bank. So I basically put together some kind of a question about this and looked at banks that have a technical core, the operations part of the bank, the buffer, which cut across different departments in the bank, and the boundary spanners that deal with external stakeholder groups, regulation, community, those kinds of things. And I put together a fairly complex process to analyze this, but basically said that the technical core would be more instrumental in the focus, the buffer would be more caring, and the boundary spanners would be more focused on law and code. And generally came up with pretty good responses in looking across 7 different departments. The only quick part of this is I was at Marquette University at the time before I came here, and again this was a class project. I had 7 students all working for the same bank. This is how I got organization-wide data. Students are fun. You just suck all sorts of information out of them and access to data and stuff. But they did this. Well, in the middle of this project, I get a phone call. Senior Vice President of HR at the bank. Dr. Weber, you know what your students did? My students? They're your employees. Oh, this is like when my grandkids do really good things, they're my grandkids. When they do bad things, they're my wife's grandkids. I understand, my students. They start passing out this survey about ethics. Well, I'm passing out a survey about health care benefits. And the employees are getting really confused. I'm like, top thing on the assignment, get permission to distribute the survey at work. They never did. Conversation kept going on. We found out that this senior VP has a PhD, loves research, and now is not going to fire my 2 students for doing something illegal. He is now having me send him the survey, which he will duplicate, distribute, collect, and send back to me. I now have a senior VP doing my data collection. This is really good stuff. So I've got really good data. I mean, phenomenally good data. I'm not real good on theory, but I know I got really good data. So this was a lot of fun. So what do I get? I get some general support for what's happening, but more importantly, do the conclusions. Oh, limitation. It's only a single organization, and it was a bank, but the subclimate is empirically supported. This is an extension of Victor and Cullen. I think this is true. You go to a hospital, you got subclimates. I think you have this kind of situation. And they're influenced by the type of work performed, doctors, nurses, technicians, and the stakeholders that they're served. Oops. But I want to go back just for a second. I also, when I got here, we had a satellite program for an organization to send their employees through their MBA program. Let's call it a large steel company with a triangular building downtown. We'll let it go at that. So I've got all these students in my class from the steel company. I said, I want you to do this study. Well, I've got now 17 different departments being surveyed. So I run the old bank structure, technical core, buffer, boundary spanner, and the data came back. Every single department was instrumental. What? That's not what we predicted. I can't get that published. This is bad. So I let it sit. 4 years later, another group of students came through, did the same study again, and now we started seeing something more like the bank. So why didn't we find it 4 years ago? We're finding it now. Well, some of you who've been here for a while understand that in the 1990s, that steel company had changed its name because it was no longer a steel company. The steel industry was going through a major problem. Most companies went out of business. Some were bought out by employees. Lots of turmoil. And we came to understand that in a crisis situation, you trench in and you become instrumental because you cover your own rear end because you're trying to survive. When things restored, a little more optimism back up to capacity, doing better, now we start worrying about other stakeholders. And it was a very telling kind of a model. We've also done this study with military units. And the active units, instrumental. Gee, their biggest job is not to die today. That's pretty important survival mode. The reservists, oh, we're concerned about community and other. It's real different because of the organizational context. So I think it's a really rich model that can be used in a lot of different contexts. Okay. But I want to show this one real quick too. I was also, and I get really lucky, I just get dumb luck. But I have, the bad news is the professor at Carnegie Mellon had to go through a medical procedure, so he asked me if I come teach his class. So I teach his class, and I sign the ethical work climate, and this woman comes up and says, I work for a company that audits physicians' offices. And we just audited a doctor's office and found out the employees are just ripping off the company like crazy. I'm going to do an ethical work climate study. When I was able to stop drooling at this opportunity for data, because this is where we know real and ethical behavior is happening, this is just really, I said, do you have a control group where you've done an audit where you haven't found things? She goes, yes. I said, oh my God, let's do this. So we did the study, and it was fascinating because basically we're saying that in 2 similar organizations, new employee behavior, if it's different, is the work climate also different? And we basically argued that we're going to find a lower ethical work climate, more instrumental, where stealing was detected. So. And found partial support. So not perfect, but still some idea here where in the carrying along code for the no theft group was greater than the theft group, and the no theft group preferred laws and code, and that was also partially supported. But the point being is if you get a chance to actually get a situation where you actually can get real data as opposed to theoretically what do you think is going to happen, I think that's really important. There's very few studies out there that actually can look at in an unethical situation, what's the war climate? You know, Enron, as it started to collapse, I bet you if I would have knocked on the door and said, can I study your company because you're about to crash and burn, this would be a great study. They're not going to listen to you. This is really tough to get this kind of data, so it's kind of fun to get a chance to do that a little bit. Okay. I want to spend a couple more minutes, and I'll have hopefully time for questions if you have any. But I do think it's important to talk about, kind of at the organizational level, this notion of corporate social responsibility, which really came out of, it could be the 20s, but more in the 50s. But it's an amazing concept where businesses start talking about, should we even care about the community? Is this even appropriate? And there's a great little court case in 1953 that where the companies actually paid money for another company, or executives paid money for a company to donate money to Princeton University, so they could sue the company for lack of fiduciary responsibility, meaning you're giving away the stockholders' money to a university as a charitable contribution, and you're not supposed to do that. It's the stockholders' money. It's a classic economic question that was tested. And the court came back saying there are 3 reasons why you can do this. It's an investment. You can make money to a university, better trained workforce, they can work for your company. So this is why corporations donate, partially why they donate, to different things. The culture and the arts. Why? Because it improves the city. You can recruit better executives here, you can keep employees here, it benefits the community. Why would you support a no drug campaign? Because you would have less cost because people, your employees may not be on drugs, you may not have security kind of safety issue in certain locations. It's an investment strategy. The other one is it's an anti-government where if corporations contribute privately, the government does not take over education. But it's also, the ruling was corporations are individuals. By law, corporations are an individual. And if we as individuals have a civic duty, so do corporations. So there's some real interesting thinking about this back in the 50s, that corporations should do this. It is probably the easiest city I've ever had to teach CSR. Carnegie, Mellon, they gave billions of dollars back to the city. The libraries, university, other kinds of things, giving back. Now you might question how they got their money, and that's a big debate, and it's a kind of a problem, like the robber barons book that's been written on them. But is this a question? So now we have Bill Gates. I'm not necessarily sure how Microsoft got all the money for him, but the fact he's trying to create an immunization program in Africa is a pretty neat use of that money, I think. We've got other philanthropers in current days. So we're talking about this notion of, is there a sense of responsibility to give back to the community? The definition is basically, should you act in a way that enhances society and its inhabitants and be held accountable for any action that affects people, community, environment? Is BP an ethical company? It's a bad question. BP was one of the good guys. BP did something that created real harm in the Gulf with the oil spill. BP is back to trying to become a good company again. They're certainly not perfect, and I hate to bring up the theological argument, but even Jesus had one bad middle manager, okay? So not every organization is going to have everybody that's perfect. But are you trying to do the right thing, and are you trying to act in a socially responsible way? Global citizenship is actually interesting because it comes out of the corporate world. It's not an academic term, but it's a corporate term about are you basically putting your commitment to social and environmental responsibility practice worldwide. And there's some great sites, which I'm not sure, oh yeah, I did, good. The Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, if you have a chance to go to this, bcccc.net, every year they run a video competition. And probably 30 of the largest named companies in the world submit a 3-minute video. And I actually assign my students to go watch these videos and pick a winner other than the one who won. It's amazing the kinds of programs these companies are doing. So it's a really rich, and this is the good examples. Lots of bad examples we can find too in the media. This is a really good example of companies are doing some really neat things and changing the world in terms of their citizenship. So, and there are also some audit standards, and this is the challenge in ethics we've always had. People used to ask me, are you ethical? Oh yeah, I'm ethical. I ask them, are you ethical? Sure, I'm ethical. Well, if you knew about business, if you ask companies, do you have quality in your product? Oh yeah. Well, then something called the Baldrige Award came out. And the Baldrige Award measures to about 3 decimal points quality. And companies had incredible metrics and standards to measure the quality of their products. And all of a sudden we took it to another whole level. Ethics is basically moved to that level as well. There are very specific measures on whether companies are ethical or not. Something called Ethisphere, which has actually come up with a really nice methodology to rate the company's ethicality and then compare their financial performance against the standards. And for the last 5 years that Ethisphere has existed, the 100 world's most ethical companies have outperformed the benchmark standards. So maybe being ethical is actually also being profitable. But the question now has become, are you meeting certain standards? So you take something like the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. They go in and look at different stakeholders, employees, customers, environment, community, etc. And sets up very specific measures that the company is being held to on a certain point in time to reach that standard. So are you offsetting carbon emissions by 30% by 2015? A very specific, measurable standard that corporations are being held accountable to. So we're starting to see more and more of that from a kind of a quantitative side of this area as well as kind of the general more subjective and normative side. And that ties into, I'm going to write social reporting a little bit. I actually was fortunate to do a study with a colleague at Duquesne on looking at the 250 largest companies and their social reports. 249 had them. And it was amazing to try to look at these reports and do some evaluation. What we're finding now is the fact that we can't find them anymore. Corporations have actually taken their social report and combined it into their financial report, which is often required by a corporation, by a country where the company is registered, that's not the word, incorporated, sorry. So the companies have to have a financial report. Now they're bringing the social report information as well, which I think shows also some legitimacy that it's not social reporting is out there for the tree huggers and social activists. It's now part of what the company's really about. It's part of the corporate citizenship. Okay. Sustainability is also a big area, and it's not my field pretty much, but I want to kind of mention about it. We deal with a lot of hospitals and other healthcare organizations about being sustainable. Our program always has UPMC as a client. And if you think about this, if you go to UPMC and you say that you could save 25 cents a year if you change that light bulb to something more efficient, how many light bulbs do you think UPMC has? Millions? Billions? You take 25 cents times, you've got a lot of big savings. And we've gotten a good response from them because they really like this concept of saving money as well as being more sustainable. So these are some of the challenges. It's a challenge for the university too, in terms of being more sustainable. There's some big major efforts going on, and one of the things Murray did was the cogeneration plant that's sitting there that hums and spews out steam. But we basically are off the grid. We don't have to buy energy now. We can basically sell some of our energy and bring us self-sufficient. So are the corporations figuring out their ecological footprint? Is there about climate change, being a sustainable organization, and these issues? So, I kind of wanted to set up the tone, and I was going to go about that long, a little bit short. But I want to kind of set up the general idea to see if there are any kind of questions or concerns that you might have, areas that you think are relevant, whatever you had. But I'd like to have a conversation if we could too. Remember, the longer I get to stay here, the less I have to go back and monitor an exam, which I don't want to do. So.